Welcome to this screencast. My name is Paul Endras, and I'm a consultant and solution architect for integration services like SQL Server and BizTalk Server for many years. Welcome to this video tutorial. This video tutorial continues the series about high availability for BizTalk Server 2016 environment with always-on availability groups in SQL Server 2016. In the first part of this video tutorial, I introduced the core concepts about the infrastructure layout for a BizTalk Server 2016 environment. The following topics were presented. I mentioned the benefits of using always-on availability groups with BizTalk Server 2016. I described some of the real-world scenarios. I outlined the high availability options with BizTalk Server 2016. And then I showed the infrastructure layout in a demo, including the prerequisites and the infrastructure layout. If you want to know more about this, please refer to the first part of this video tutorial. After this introduction, I will briefly describe the very basics of always-on availability groups in SQL Server 2016. Then I will cover the prerequisites for always-on availability groups for the BizTalk Server 2016 environment. Next, I will point you to the setup steps needed for the always-on availability groups and show you this in a demo. So, let's start with it. What are the availability groups in SQL Server 2016? Basically, the concept of always-on availability groups is to provide high availability on the level of the database. This contrasts to the concept of high availability on the level of the service that we know from the classic failover cluster. As we have seen in part 1 of this video tutorial, we use always-on availability groups together with Windows Server failover cluster to achieve high availability. The Windows failover cluster provides automatic failover in case of failure. The availability groups are in fact used as cluster resources. Therefore, the availability groups are considered to be a unit for failover. That is the very basic concept. Now, let's have a look at the database layer. The SQL Server hosts the instances for each database that are part of the always-on availability group in the BizTalk Server environment. In the given scenario, we have 3 instances for every database configured. In this picture, you can see from the right to the left. Firstly, the database instances themselves are actually cluster resources, as we discussed in the first part of the video tutorial. From the SQL Server perspective, each of them is called a replica, where the primary is the active instance and all the others are secondaries. All of the replicas together form an availability group. In general, with SQL Server 2016, it is possible to have more than one database in every availability group. Due to restrictions of handling the isolation of transactions in the MSDTC in the BizTalk Server environment, we can, however, only set one database of the core BizTalk databases per availability group. Secondly, the cluster resources are set up as listeners to the always-on availability groups. And thirdly, the listeners are represented to the BizTalk Server as virtual node names. That is the notion for a database connection. So, what's needed for the always-on availability groups in SQL Server 2016? To set up the availability groups in SQL Server 2016, we need at least the Windows failover cluster service installed and the SQL instances configured. To get acquainted with the basics of the availability groups, please refer to the Getting Started document online. But that's not the whole game. There are a few options that have to be considered when using always-on availability groups for BizTalk Server 2016 environment. I will highlight these options here. So, let's jump into the demo right now. Here, we are connected to the first SQL Server instance. This is where the primary replica will be set up. First of all, we should check the proper configuration of the network settings for SQL Server instances on this machine. Therefore, we are using the SQL Configuration Manager tool. Make sure to have the proper network protocol set. Next, we go and enable AlwaysOn availability group feature per instance. Here you can see the Windows cluster which has been set up in this given scenario. Make sure the checkbox for AlwaysOn availability groups feature is enabled. In the next step, we have to prepare the database for AlwaysOn availability groups. Make a full backup of your primary replica using the SQL Server Management Console. Later on, copy the backup files to all the planned secondary host instances of SQL Server. Restore the backup on all participating secondary host instances. Use the option Restore with Recovery for this purpose. Configure a new TCP endpoint for every replica within the availability group. Be aware of the TCP port numbers. The AlwaysOn availability group need the TCP port numbers for communication from the cluster to the server instances and vice versa. Check the proper permissions for the SQL service accounts and grant access as needed. Due to the lack of cross-database transactions, the availability groups have to be configured with the following tsql command. You can later edit the availability groups with the UI wizard, but you cannot create the availability groups at first. You can set up the SQL listeners later. Hence, it is recommended to prepare the IP numbers and the DNS names in advance. For the purpose of clarity, I have used a numerical scheme for the TCP ports on every database replica. This makes it easy to organize and recognize their membership to a certain availability group, as you can see here. Make sure TCP communication is running smooth between the SQL instances. Hence, double-check the TCP ports and also take into consideration firewall exceptions. Connect to the replica of your availability group. Later on, you can add any database to your availability group with a single click. Define a listener for every availability group and assign a static IP address to it. In my example, I used a listener called BTS16 SSO list. Now we check the TCP communication. For this purpose, I'm using the TCP viewer from sysinternals. It shows the TCP ports in detail. Compare the local port numbers to the availability group's properties. The state established in the TCP viewer indicates a valid communication for the TCP ports. Finally, we configure the BizTalk Server 2016 to use the SQL listeners for the single sign-on and for the BizTalk group. Therefore, we use the previously mentioned name of the listeners and the TCP port number. In this video tutorial, I explained the database layer of the AlwaysOn availability groups in SQL Server 2016 when used for the BizTalk Server 2016 environment. I mentioned the prerequisites and I also showed you the most significant topics when setting up the AlwaysOn availability groups in SQL Server 2016 for the BizTalk Server 2016 environment. In the next part of this video tutorial, I will demonstrate the high availability feature within the BizTalk server in action running a business process. If you like this video, click the like button below. If you want to see more of my videos in the future, click also the subscribe button. Thanks for watching.